Hello, everybody, and welcome to Commodity Culture, where our goal is to make you a better investor in the commodities sector. My name is Jesse Day. Before we dive in, nothing here is investment advice. Do your own due diligence. And today's guest is the CEO of Military Metals, a company engaged in the acquisition, exploration, and development of mineral properties with a focus on antimony, a fascinating commodity that I cannot wait to dive into. It's Scott Eldridge. Great to have you on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jesse. Good to see you and looking forward to our conversation today.
Me as well. I want to start off with some information on antimony itself because this is a commodity that doesn't get a lot of press and yet it's absolutely critical. So let's start with the basics. What is antimony and what are its main use cases?
Right, Jesse. So antimony can be classified as a minor metal. It is an opaque market where it's not exchange traded. There's no futures contracts. And the pricing is basically similar to uranium, where a researcher that would publish today's spot price would call, say, five different buyers or traders and just make an average of today's spot price, which is $48,500 per ton as of today. So antimony is classified as a metalloid. On the periodic table, it's element number 51. And it has widespread usage in our daily lives, ranging from renewable energy to traditional lead acid batteries. But what's come to the forefront more recently is its application in the defense sector. And antimony is paramount to the defense sector. It's absolutely critical for militaries around the world to have access to antimony to fulfill their defense needs. And antimony has really come to the forefront here in the last few months because the world's largest producer, China, has recently announced an export ban, which has created a supply crunch. While we're seeing increased demand, and that's led to the dramatic rise in the antimony price. And it's created a lot of attention surrounding antimony. Investors are getting to know it better, and investors are looking how to get exposure to this particular metal. And the only way to really do that is through the pure mining equities that have direct mineral properties in their portfolio that are focused on antimony. And that's exactly what we're doing here at Military Metals.
I got to pull on that thread regarding the pricing. You talked about antimony having an opaque spot market similar to uranium. So is there also a long-term contracting market then? And is that also similar to uranium in that it's a lot of these long-term contracts in the uranium space often have non-disclosure agreements attached to them. So it's sometimes difficult to get a grasp on what the long-term contract price is. Well, is there similar dynamics in play when it comes to antimony?
Well, I think antimony will move in that direction to see long-term contracts, but as of today, that doesn't exist. And a long-term contract is sort of a protection mechanism for the end consumer or purchaser of the uranium to know that they have the security of that supply. And in antimony, for the last 2 decades, nobody's been forced to do that because the Western world could buy all the antimony they wanted from China. They had a stable, reliable supply. It was easy to transact, and there was no incentive to enter into the obligation of a longer term contract. But I think we're going to start to see a shift in that in the antimony market, particularly from defense companies, where they're looking for exposure in terms of a direct supply, perhaps even with the mine itself versus just a trader, so they can secure their antimony needs and other defense metals as well. But they're going to have to start locking into longer term contracts to ensure that they can deliver to their customers the end products for which they need these very critical raw materials to produce.
That's really interesting. Let's talk about the supply chain for antimony. You mentioned China, you mentioned them restricting exports. How is the supply chain currently set up? Which countries produce the most antimony at present? China, obviously a big player in the game, so maybe you could talk about them and provide some more color on those export restrictions as well.
So with most of the minor metals and the rare earths, we can sort of lump them into this category where at a mine site, typically what is produced is a concentrate. So it's not an end product. So that concentrate has to be refined. And again, with all the other minor metals as well, for the last several decades, China has built out the refining capacity for lithium, antimony, germanium, gallium, all these interesting metals that people are starting to get to know now. And the Western world basically didn't have to invest in refineries because we had secured reliable supply from China. But guess what? That's all stopped now. So the Western world is basically in a catch-up mode now to try and build out not just the mining side of these critical minerals, but also the refining side. And that's not going to happen tomorrow. It'll take a few years, a few decades to build that out. But the ball is rolling in a positive manner to start to see things like that happen. And then if we take a step back and look at the mining reserve side of antimony, so you asked about that. So there's 3 countries that are unfriendly to the Western world, being China, Russia, and Tajikistan. And those 3 countries collectively control about 83% of the world's antimony mining reserves. So the mineral content, geologically speaking, is confined basically to these 3 countries. And then China, as I talked about on the refining side, these metals have to be refined to become industrial grade products. China controls more than 50% of the world's refining. So China is basically calling the shots here on the antimony market, and by them turning off the tap that started with export restrictions and then escalated to a full-out export ban, has now basically put antimony in this very vulnerable position where the Western world is finding it very challenging to get its hands on antimony. And that's why we need to see more investment capital go into exploration, development, and that further upstream refining in Europe and Canada, in the US, and we're starting to contribute to that progress through what we're doing at Military Metals.
Well, everything you've outlined really feeds into the investment thesis for antimony. But maybe you could expand on that further. If you were speaking to somebody like a lot of our viewers who are investors in the commodities space, aside from everything you've mentioned, or perhaps emphasizing certain points of it, why is antimony a commodity that you would be paying attention to?
Right. Well, it is on the critical mineral list of most countries around the world, including Canada, the US, Australia, Japan, the European Union. And that's for a very good reason, because the military and, again, renewable energy, they just can't operate without an access to antimony. There's no substitutes. And it's key to any of those demand pillars, where getting access to that precious supply of antimony is so key. It's also used quite widely. Probably about 60% of global demand is for flame retardants. So if you can imagine any first world electronics, children's clothing, military uniforms and tents, they all have an antimony compound in them that is a flame retardant. And that, again, that's about 60% of global demand. And then from there, we would go into glass panels for solar farms. Antimony is used in the development of the glass and the panels to help reduce bubbling effect in the glass. It's also used to build nuclear reactors. So it's key to many of these different industries, and we don't have any substitutes. And again, we haven't been exploring for antimony in the Western world. The last time the U.S. saw domestic antimony production was over 20 years ago. But you're seeing governments around the world, in Canada, the US, again, European Union, that are starting to deploy capital into these companies to help move these projects forward quicker, with the goal of bringing on domestic supply to not have to be so reliant on China for that critical supply chain component.
Well, we're going to dive into military metals in just a second. Obviously, that's one vehicle through which investors can get exposure to antimony. But what other vehicles do investors have to access the antimony market? You mentioned there's no futures market. I'm guessing there's no ETF that holds antimony in any sense. There's no physical fund like a uranium trust or something like that. Are there any big producers out there? Where do investors have to look to deploy capital when it comes to antimony specifically?
Yes, Jesse, that's a great question. And we get that question all the time from investors. So as you've noted, there is no physical ETF such as there is for, say, gold and silver. There's no future forward contracts for investors to participate in. So the only opportunity to get exposure to the rising antimony price is to invest in the pure play mining equities. And it's a very limited space. There's a few listed in Canada, and then there's also a few listed on the ASX down in Australia. But the top companies, you can count them on one hand, Jesse. And I'll also note that for 2024, antimony was the top performing metal commodity. It rose about 193% last year, and it was second. Top of the podium for all commodities was cocoa. So again, antimony was the top performing metal for last year, and it's out to a very strong start since January 1st. And there isn't really any predictions for that trend to end anytime soon. So investors, if you're looking to come along for the antimony ride here, again, the only way to do that is to invest in the pure plays.
Wow, highest performing metal commodity of 2024, and yet not really talked about much at all in the mainstream financial press, let alone even on other smaller programs as well. I think that's a great segue into discussing how military metals fits into the picture. So could you start by giving us an overview of the company?
Right. So obviously we're publicly listed on 3 different exchanges in Canada, the US, as well as Frankfurt over in Germany. And we have a very dedicated board with a lot of experience in the minor metals space. In our group here in Vancouver, we're backing this company with substantial ownership behind it. And going back 6 to 8 months ago, we saw a storm brewing in the antimony space, where we saw a potential supply crunch coming. And with this being Trump's second term in the office, we did note that during his first term, there was a bit of tariff action there as well. And I'm not saying we had a crystal ball, but we saw something brewing in the minor metal space, antimony in particular, that if China were to turn off the tap, we would be in the exact situation we're in right now, where we're seeing the metal here at almost $50,000 per ton. So ourselves being investors, we just saw it as an opportunity. Basically, at the bottom of the antimony market, we were able to pick up 3 assets. And from a geological perspective, antimony is usually associated with gold. But what's really important to look at, Jesse, is what is the primary metal and what is the byproduct. So there's some gold mines that have an antimony byproduct to them, but we wanted to identify primary antimony projects that had gold byproducts. So we picked up 3 projects, one over in your neck of the woods in the European Union in Slovakia. That's our flagship asset called Troyerova. Our second asset is located in Nova Scotia, Canada. It's called West Gore, and that was a past producing mine during World War I. And then our third project, I was just visiting last week, is down in Nevada called Last Chance, and that's also a past producer. So what we offer to our shareholders is a diversified portfolio in 3 top mining jurisdictions, and all 3 of them have the commonality of being brownfields projects. So I'll briefly touch on Troyerova, but this was meant to be an antimony mine, high grade underground. The average grade is 2.5% on the Soviet era resource, with a 0.6 gram per ton gold byproduct to it. And again, this was meant to be a mine. There was an added advance into the hillside. There's 1.7 kilometers worth of added and underground drifting, and they drilled 15,000 meters on it and defined a resource that at today's prices is close to $3 billion worth of antimony metal in the ground. So that's our flagship, and we're moving that forward as fast as we can. The next step would be to deliver a National Instrument 43-101 resource on the property. And then from there, we would immediately go into a PEA, a preliminary economic assessment, to get a snapshot of sort of what the economics looks like in terms of NPV, IRR, payback, and mine life, etc.
I'd love to just pull on a thread there for a moment, and that is Slovakia. Your flagship project is there, and it's not a jurisdiction that comes up a lot. I'm just wondering, from your perspective, operating in Slovakia, how is it as a jurisdiction in terms of dealing with the local community, the government, the regulations, the political situation, and all of those things?
So it is a great jurisdiction. It's not often talked about because it's one of the smaller countries in Central Europe. And I first visited Slovakia for the first time, I would say about 12 years ago. And I went to visit a past producing underground silver mine that actually had an antimony byproduct to it. So being a small country, it also has the benefit of being in the Tethyan mineral belt. And Slovakia just happens to be very blessed with rich antimony mineralization. And the area that we're in has a very rich history in mining, going back over 500 or 600 years of mining for pyrite, gold, and antimony. Our project is actually 3 kilometers away from Slovakia's one of Slovakia's largest historical producers called Pezinok, and we appear to be the on-strike extension of that same high-grade deposit. So there's a very rich mining culture here. Any of the small towns in the area that I've driven through, they have mining museums, and people talk about mining at the dinner table with their grandparents because that's the sector that they used to work in. So it's got the right geology and the right political and permitting environment. Of course, Slovakia is a full-blown member of the European Union. And one thing we haven't talked about yet, Jesse, is that over in Europe, and you probably know this full well, but more for your audiences, the Critical Raw Materials Act was something that was recently adopted with many goals. But the one that stands out to us is that they want to try and fast track domestic mineral projects where that mineral is on the critical list. And of course, antimony is. And along with that act, there's a lot of access to capital in the form of grants, equity, project finance, loans, off-taker financing. But one of the things that really stands out to me that will allow us to fast track this project is that the Critical Raw Materials Act has a fast track permitting process. And that's something we haven't really seen in the Western world, and it's definitely music to our ears, where there's now stated legislation that enables us to move this project forward as fast as possible.
And then so the next step is moving towards a preliminary economic assessment in Slovakia. Could you also touch on what's happening with your projects in Canada and in the US? Wherever you think it's important to hone in on, feel free, and any progress you've made so far as well.
Right. So Slovakia is definitely our crown jewel. So we're looking forward to finishing up the NI 43101 resource. And as you said, immediately going into a PEA. And then in the background to that, we have our West Score property in Nova Scotia. This was a past producing high grade underground antimony / gold mine during World War I, where they were sending the antimony over to Wales at the time to support the Allied war efforts. So right now we're just designing our initial work program on the West Score project. We would probably start out with some geophysics, mapping, and sampling, but we'd also like to drill on that property. And from the history there, we know that there's high-grade mineralization, so we want to work forward, move that project forward as well. And then third on the list would be Nevada. As I said, I was just down there last week, and it was a pleasure just to dig through some of the old waste piles and look at visual stibnite, and we've sent samples over to the lab. So the next step there would be to identify drill targets. Both Nova Scotia and Nevada, would be very small work programs. Maybe a 10-hole program, but our focus is definitely Slovakia. That's the most advanced asset, and we also have significant backing from the European Union encouraging us to move that forward.
And could you shine some light on the team behind Military Metals, starting with yourself, and how you came to be CEO of the company?
Right. So I've been in the metals and mining industry now for 17 years. MBA in corporate finance, started off as a mining analyst for a German fund, ran my own merchant banking firm after that, sourcing European institutional capital for Canadian mining companies, raised several $100 million over my career. Been on the issuer side of the business now for the last 6 or 7 years. I started off with a management team of a company called Amarillo Gold. We developed a gold project down in Brazil from discovery through feasibility and full permitting, had it shovel ready, and then we were taken over by a larger company called Hawkchild. And that's a very similar playbook that we could potentially see here with Military Metals for our shareholders. And then I came in as the CEO of this company in September. It was put together by our group here in Vancouver, where again we just did a global search for antimony projects, and we identified 3 opportunities where we saw that high grade ratio of antimony to gold, and we were able to pick these assets up at the bottom of the market. And then I'm augmented by a very strong management team led by our VP Exploration, a gentleman named Avram Howard. Been in the business for 40 years. He's had several discoveries to his name that have become mines. And then on the board of directors, some pretty powerful names there as well. Mick Carew, PhD geologist. He's a former banker at Haywood. Had a couple of decades experience with BHP and Ivanhoe, so bigger company opportunities there. And then Mark Saxon has been our latest addition to the board. He's Australian as well as Mick. And Mark has significant experience in rare earths, which is quite similar on the processing side to antimony, as we've talked about. And Mark is also a founder of Southern Cross Gold, which has been a tremendous success down in Australia, with probably over a 700 million market cap now off of a discovery of a gold antimony project. And we also have very supportive shareholders that continue to increase their ownership in the company. Our stock is very liquid, as you've probably seen, compared to our peers. We do trade millions of shares a day. And so we're definitely attracting a lot of attention with our liquidity and giving people exposure to antimony.
And what are some upcoming catalysts that shareholders can look forward to here in 2025 and beyond for the company?
Right. So again, I'm sort of repeating myself, but we're working with a company called SLR. They're an independent resource firm. So we're working with them to basically transition that Soviet era resource into a modern NI 43-101 resource. Again, we know it's a high grade deposit. We plan on doing some infill holes as a part of that program. So before the resource, people will start to see some high grade mineral intercepts from the Triarova property in Slovakia. After the resource, again, we'll go into the PEA. We'll also probably look forward to, within the next 2 to 3 months, starting an initial drill program on the West Square property. And if you go back to when I first started with the company, we've been extremely active. We typically have a news release every week. There's a lot going on with the company. We love to keep our shareholders updated, and the antimony and sort of defense sector landscape just continues to be very dynamic, and it's almost changing on a daily basis. The most recent news from the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen is that she's now making an approval here for European Union countries to increase their percentage of GDP ratio in terms of investing in the defense sector from 2% of GDP now to 5% of GDP. So that's going to put an even larger pressure on the defense companies. And again, those companies need the raw materials like antimony to be able to create their munitions for their customers. So I definitely predict a bright future here for antimony. I don't think the current spot price is the end. There's several analysts out there that are predicting another double from here. So it's a great opportunity for investors to start to get involved now if you're not already.
Yeah, that seems like a really good synergy when it comes to the EU, both the Critical Raw Materials Act plus the increased defense spending. It looks like it's all moving in antimony's favor. I'll end by opening the floor to you. Is there anything we haven't yet covered about military metals, or anything you want to emphasize that you think it's important for potential shareholders to be aware of?
That's a good question, Jesse. So, I would say in more recent times, investors are becoming more and more educated on these bespoke metals. And going back 5 or 10 years ago, if we tried to put an antimony company together, people would not have been interested. But we're finding that the audience out there is, with people like you helping out, is just becoming more and more educated. So I'm finding it easier to talk to people about antimony now. And there was a Forbes article a few years ago that had a title that said "Antimony, the most important metal you've never heard of." And that proverb, still holds true a little bit today. But again, we're finding that people are more and more knowledgeable, and they're seeing an opportunity to have an allocation for these special metals in their portfolio, along with, say, gold or silver. But antimony is starting to not become mainstream, but it's starting to become more widespread in terms of the knowledge base there.
Well, Scott, this has been a fantastic conversation. It was great learning all about antimony and military metals. For those who do want to learn more, I'm going to put a link in the description below to the Military Metals website as well as social media profile. Scott, thank you once again for coming on and sharing your knowledge with the audience.
Yeah, it was a pleasure, Jesse. Thanks for having me today.
Commodity Culture is a series on commodities and natural resources. If you would like to see more, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell notification so you're always up to date with the latest episodes.